Now we have Jon Peterson, RPG historian, writer of many of the books behind me, and font of knowledge of Dungeons and Dragons history and prehistory. Morning.
Morning. You've got
Um,
quite a spread of my books back there, which,
I
I
know
never do. I always just have this as my background. So, you know.
I change it for everyone I speak to, and this isn't obvious. This is about half of your books, isn't it? I mean, the
Yeah, I
elusive
know.
is which way am I
Right.
going? Elusive is there as well,
Yeah, yeah.
but
It
it's
is
not
about,
been.
yeah, it doesn't have like Art and Arcana or lore and legends or any of that kind of stuff,
I
but
haven't got any of
it's
the recipe stuff.
it's got good stuff there though. It's got stuff I like.
Thought I'd start with asking you something really, really easy, which is, in your view, were role-playing games invented in England?
So, I mean, my view is that role-playing game is so poorly defined that
Mm,
you can, just by kind of moving the goalposts sufficiently, you could position its invention in Germany, in
mm.
the UK, in the United States. And so it's really just kind of how strictly you want to limit what we mean by that term.
So my book is about psychology stuff, and one of the things that really interests me, and I'm still working on, I've started writing, but I'm still doing lots of research, is the potential for real differences between the personalities of people who run games as games masters or design them, on the one hand, and players on the other. And I remember you and I had a little chat about this last time, but I didn't go into it in much detail. So one of the thoughts that I had in relation to the question of where RPGs sprung, is who we might consider the first games master in the sense that we would recognize in terms of the definition of the term today. And I was wondering if it wasn't possibly Tony Barth.
So, I mean, Tony Bath is a great candidate for this. I mean, again, move the goalposts enough, and I think you can say Rice Fitz in the 1820s, right, was running a game where he was a referee and he had a series of players, and those players communicated with him through words, through statements of intention, effectively. I would like my troops to do this. He would take those words, go figure out what happened, and report back to them. Well, this is the result of your action. If we just take that loop to be what it is that is a role-playing game,
Hmm.
then war games from basically, the nearly the dawn of the time people even use the term should qualify. And this is indeed why my book, The Elusive Shift, is called The Elusive Shift, because it is so hard to figure out where to draw a delineation between these practices. But I mean, you can certainly make a great case that the postal dimensions of the Hyborian campaign, and this, goes back all the way to the 1950s, were absolutely seminal in terms of introducing a community to that concept. And, it was no different for Bath in the early days of Hyboria, right? People would write to him and say, I am playing Conan and I would like to have, these are my actions for Conan for the following prescribed period of time. And Tony Blair would come back and say, Tony Bath would come back and say, Tony Blair, uh, I'm revealing for the first time, Tony Blair was actually there in these campaigns while he was yeah, in secondary school. No, so Tony Bath would write back and say, yes, this is the result of your actions. And so, I mean, how different is that from what Reiswitz was doing? And, but then fast forward this to the early 1970s when the Society of Ancients was in full swing. They were having their meetings and tournaments. And there's this whole thing I talk about in Playing at the World in a chapter aptly titled Characters Run Amok. That is the Sunday battles that they conducted for the Society of Ancients. And these were much more in-person affairs where people took on fantasy characters, and rather than this being in writing and, through the post and thus at this kind of, geological time scale, this was all in real time happening where, Tony Bath would be running and like people would be telling him, I try to do this, and they'd have to, some would speak to him secretly and they're all kind of competing or in some cases collaborating around certain objectives in the game. Those start to feel much more like a role-playing game in the sense that D&D made us think about role-playing games.
Yeah. So people, this is a tough question. I mean, they're all tough questions. I'm just going to be entirely honest. Um, as far as I know, Tony Barth, just to take that example, or let's take Dave Arneson as well. They shared some DMing experience with some of the other people in their group, but certainly not all of them. There were some people who were permanently players and didn't want to do anything other than play.
Hmm.
And it's a question that I don't know the answer to. I don't know that you do, but why do you think some people are given to one role and some are given to the other?
At the very end of the elusive shift, I make an argument, and it's kind of because it is in literally the final paragraphs of the book, that may be a bit of a throwaway argument, but I think a lot of what in the pages that preceded it supports this position that really, when D&D came out, it was two games. The first game was this dungeon exploration game, and there was a referee who drew dungeons out, and like players would be the people who would go investigate it. But then there was the second game that shipped with it, this meta game, which was this open invitation to people to take these rules and do whatever they wanted with them, and to make systems of tremendous simplicity or complexity to their liking, to treat these rules merely as an ample framework. And the engagement with the rules that entails, I think, is integral to the function of DMing as it was originally described in the 1974 rules, anyway. And that metagame is what ended up being the genesis of the entire RPG industry. When people then took that invitation to such extremes that they were, creating systems for superheroes instead of for, fantasy adventurers like magic users and clerics and so on, right? And so, there's a sense in which that world building and system building and um, that facility that maybe, and this might be where your question is really going, this facility some people possess to generate worlds and to consistently maintain them, and along with them, the rules of their operation really appeals to some people. I know I'm one of those people. I much rather run than play. Um, and, I think other people love the immersiveness that is offered by that experience of having a referee who literally is in charge of the world that way, where you merely are reacting to, um, a set of described conditions and saying what your character would do in those circumstances, which speaks to a very different facility. I mean, you're the psychologist, which I'm not at all. So I'm looking to you for the answers to this. You're on the hook in this call, actually, not me. But I mean, it seems to me that the latter, the player role in at least in early RPGs, before people started to contest the authority of the RPG, the dungeon master too much. It's not all that different from just the the facility players use is the same facility we use to answer just hypothetical questions. Like you and I are sitting in a coffee shop right now, imagine. And I say, if somebody walked in the door right now with a gun and said, hands up, what would you do? Like there is something built into us, I think, right, that lets us entertain these hypotheticals in language, described by language. And even with the little bit that I flesh out about that, is it a Starbucks? Is it, does the guy walk in? Is he carrying an M16? Is he, carrying a tiny little airsoft gun, right? Like none of that was sketched out, but you get a picture in your mind from this, and your ability to address that hypothetical from that very bare linguistic description, that's something we get built in. And I don't know why. You're the guy who's on the hook to know why that's true. But the facility to be able to do that, I think, it's different. There's a different set of things that fire off to be able to answer and respond to conditions of hypotheticals like that are verbally expressed than there is to generate the consistent world behind it. And those do seem like they're two very different skills, actually.
Hmm.
Um, and they don't have a lot of overlap.
Agreed. And I am completely on the hook. And I'm doing research on this at the moment. And I hadn't really come prepared for that question in terms of bringing the answers because I've got some of them already, got some data now. Role-play, role-playing games couldn't exist without dungeon masters because players can't really invent them by themselves. There has to be someone who is the omniscient. Is that a fair thing to say?
Oh, well, I mean, I think that the history of the RPG industry, especially indie games, has largely been the problematization and ultimately subversion of the authority of the DM. And we see this quite early on in these games like On Guard, right, which is a game released in 1975 by Game Designers Workshop that had no DM, right? There was a game of kind of 16th century decadent swashbuckling and kinds of that this Cavaliers world, like where I mean effectively the structure of the game was based around diplomacy, where for a prescribed period of time each of the players would kind of say this is what they did over that time, and they would simultaneously reveal what it was that they'd done and then determine, kind of suss out between all themselves like what the results were of that happening. And You see this much more these days in games like, Gray Ranks or Fiasco, Jason Morningstar games, right? That very intentionally don't have a DM, or the players do everything themselves. And there's a certain amount of this DNA as well built into all of the Powered by the Apocalypse games, the games that follow Apocalypse World, games like Dungeon World and so on. So I mean, there's a quite a long tradition of pushing back on this, but I agree with you that in their original pure form, in the 1974 form, and indeed in the Tony Bath form, and even I'd argue the Ricefitz form, right? Like the referee took on a responsibility for being able to adjudicate the events of the game world and responsibility for secret information that the players did not possess that made them effectively omnipotent.
Mm.
And, I mean, the famous story about a kid at a convention, who had Dave Arneson as a player. And, Arneson walks into the first room of the dungeon, and the kid says, well, a 10,000-pound weight falls out of the ceiling and it crushes you and you're dead. And then went around the dungeon saying, the whole convention saying, my dungeon was so deadly, I killed Dave Arneson. Right. And of course, the omnipotence of the dungeon master allows you to do anything, right? Not necessarily to make for an interesting game by doing so, but that I think that's very much a backlash against precisely that, against maybe not that extreme an example, but a lot of designers felt that there were arbitrary, biased decisions that were being made by omnipotent referees, and they have sought for 50 years now to find systems that resolve that as a problem. So I wouldn't say it's necessary to RPGs that you have this. I think it was necessary for the experience that most of us have with D&D.
Mm.
And I think it's this experience most of us consider to be the canonical experience of a role-playing game,
Mm.
to have that omnipotent referee.
Mm.
But it's not without its detractors.
Yeah, and of course, I'm reminded of the early Dragon magazine. I think I was talking to Tim about this the other day. When Gary was writing, he wrote a letter in, I think it was issue 16, complaining about the ideas he's been getting. I mean, strong suggestions he'd been getting via fanzines and via letters about changing the game. And of course, you pointed out in one of your books, the one of the fanzines said something along the lines of the game is too important for Gary Gygax to be in charge of. So yeah, there's definitely
Now that's the meta game being
yeah,
too important for Gary Gygax to be in charge of, not the actual game.
yeah.
Although the same guy who said that, Mark Swanson, also played in the Tomb of Horrors at Origins in 1975 and complained about Gary Gygax as a dungeon master, or at least as a game designer, for having made this like completely arbitrary death trap. And so I think that there is some kinship between the play of the game and the meta game.
So why do you? This was another question I've written down. This seems like a good question to ask it, a good time to ask it, which is, how would you explain the resilience of Dungeons and Dragons, given that it hasn't actually changed a hell of a lot since the early couple of years, which is remarkable for a game that's 50 years in the running and has gone through multiple published editions. But the six core attributes are there, D20s, attribute scores. I mean,
Experience level, the basic concept of dungeon exploration. Yeah.
yeah, it's still as far as I know, the most popular, the most played tabletop role-playing game that there is today. What would you put that down to?
I think this is a fantastic question. And, it certainly has had it's waxed and waned
Mm,
over the years. And so I don't think I would characterize it as, a consistent like domination of the industry. But I mean, effectively, even at its lowest ebb, it's still been in the running for the top one or two, right? Things that people are playing at any given time. Um, and it is a really good question. I mean, I think it lit upon something timeless with a timeless appeal to it. I think it unlocks a play style that is very intuitive. It's kind of easy. I mean, they wouldn't have said so in the 70s when, people perceived it being quite a high bar to entry to be able to play either as a player or let alone the referee, which was, viewed as an enormously like onerous task. But I mean, it is, I think, quite intuitive compared to other things people have made in the genre. I think it's always been very permissive and kind of let you have it your own way. which is interestingly something that a lot of the indie games that reject the authority of the referee, they instead arrogate it to themselves, right? In the sense of, I think D&D is often so not prescriptive about what you do that every other game feels like the way to differentiate is to be more prescriptive, to have a specific setting that you're playing in, or to really, limit the player's ability to do this or the referee's ability to do that, and kind of lay down almost more like board game mechanics on top of this. Um, D&D has always been really good at being kind of a generalist, vague game.
Mm.
And probably the least popular incarnation of it was the least vague, the fourth edition, which
Mm.
really did
Mm.
try to be, I think, much more mechanically prescriptive than any edition of D&D has been. And some people love it for that because it's actually much more precise than other games are. I can remember an early critic that talked about, trying to improve the systems of D&D, who basically argued like the game is such a game of crude approximation anyway, like it wouldn't benefit from actually like making any of the systems any tighter. And I think that's kind of true and always has been. But I don't know that I think that's a great. I think there should be a book length treatment of that question of why it is that
I
D&D.
demand an acknowledgement, John. I
Yes, right. Well,
demand.
not by me. I mean, but like, because you think, I mean, if you look back on just the historical accidents, putting, such as it is, my historian cap on for a moment, um, if you just imagine James Dallas Egbert III, that boy who was supposed to have disappeared in the steam tunnels in 1979, if instead of D&D books in his room, they had found Tunnels and Trolls books or RuneQuest books, would we be having an entirely different conversation right now? It could be too, they're just historical accidents because D&D's popularity was so elevated by that, right? And I mean, it's really difficult to overstate the amount of publicity that the game got. And, what if it had been some other game?
That is an amazing sliding doors question, isn't it? I had never thought of that. I mean, again, when I spoke to Tim, this was a few months ago, the first time, I asked him when he felt the moment was that instead of scraping by, they were now flourishing as a company, TSR. And he said, Dallas Egbert. That was the moment for him. So yeah, if there had been, RuneQuest had been out at that point as well. It was 1978.
Yeah.
That's really, really. I have to think about that a bit more. In relation to RuneQuest, so one thing I don't know how much you go into system in terms of things like universal. So and even the psychology of systems, which is something I'm going to get into in the latter part of my research, because that I don't need people for. I just need to look at rule systems. So one thing that's kind of interesting, D&D is very much about categorizing people. So character classes are just it's blunt force instrument. You are a wizard. You can't pick up a sword. Even though it makes no sense in real life, but they make
And
no
Gandalf
apologies for that.
clearly did, right? So what are they
But
basing this on? And Gandalf clearly could pick up a sword, so
yes,
yes.
and could barely cast spells apparently as well. So and then you had RuneQuest on the other hand, which didn't really have classes, had a very different system in terms of skills, had a different system of getting better at skills, which is one that really made it quite famous in the day, wasn't it? Which is effectively the better you are at something, the harder it is to get better at it.
Hmm.
And if you wanted to avoid that sort of categorization, you could find it. So you've got these two different systems for skills. You've got these two different systems for how you would classify your character, but they both ran and still run. They both still exist. So what are the universals? If you boiled away all these optional features that you can quite easily change from one system to another, what would you be left with? That's a difficult question, but do you have an idea
I
about
mean,
that?
I think the Chaosium people tried to do this exercise in 1980 when they released Basic Role Playing. Basic Role Playing was an attempt to take the system of RuneQuest and distill it down into 16 pages, including an example of play. So pretty stripped down. That just kind of said, what is it you do when you play these games? And this is a very different exercise than doing Holmes Basic or Moldvay Basic, right, for D&D, where they were basically, they would have the D&D system and it was restricted in terms of your character level in which monsters and items and so on appeared in it, but was effectively just an introductory version. I mean, BRP was an attempt to say there is an engine, a core to this that you can eject and go inspect on the table over there. And then they can plug that engine into Call of Cthulhu. They can plug it into Superworld. They can plug it into like a variety of other games that existed and, their kind of growing universe around this. And, you know, it, it was the first important universal system, I think. And what does it have? Well, yeah, it has abilities. It has the rules for advancement, for progression, as we say. And the progression systems of that form. I mean, they'd existed before. Bunnies and Burrows has some somewhat similar progression system to RuneQuest. And obviously, a lot of Steve Perrin's design drew on his previous Perrin conventions that he had developed for playing D&D circa 1976 and circulated at local conventions in the Bay Area, like DundraCon and things like that, which had skill systems that would be recognizable to us. I think now we would say a skill system is de rigueur for like any RPG. Of course, there were no skill systems effectively in D&D prior to Oriental Adventures. I guess probably where we draw, and then second edition really picked that up and turned it into its own independent mechanic applicable to all character classes. But maybe we say the thief class is when this was truly inaugurated, and that was all the way back, right, 1974, that we began to see the thief class take shape. But those were specific to that particular class, and these abilities were very cordoned off from what a fighter could do or a cleric could do, and things like that. Um, but skill system would be a big part of it. Some kind of combat simulation, a conflict simulation system has to be a component to it. There have to be rules for, trying to hit something, rules for how much damage you can withstand, and kind of what the forms of mitigation or endurance or what have you will let you withstand amounts of damage over time. And basic role playing also is one of the first places where they really tried to capture that loop I was talking about. It uses openly the term statement of intention to describe what it is that the player is supposed to deliver. And then, as a result of a statement of intention, the game master returns with an expositive. Well, this is what happened. And so there are these statements that have very different, I mean, ontological. I mean, there's a philosophical Austin speech acts. There's perlocutionary like statements and then illocutionary. Is that right? Geez,
I'll take
I'm,
your word for it
I'm
on that.
rusty on my speech act theory, but like there's a distinction, right, between these statements that are supposed to be like tentative and statements that are supposed to be actual, like, authoritative. This is really what's going on sorts of statements. But um, I mean, and I think it's crucial that they managed to extract that out as well in that like 16 pages. I don't know if that answers your question, but I mean, those are at least when I look at what the exercise was in 1980 of distilling down the core of what was in this. It's independent of setting or independent of, what kinds of things you might want to do. I mean, that's the first definitive exercise in that anybody did.
I think the difficulty I have with this, with the question as I try and answer it in my own head, is I actually wonder if there is such a thing as anything which is core, which you can write down. Um, because presumably you could have a game where you just took all the attributes, ripped all the attributes out, and said, okay, you are you could describe it narratively. You're quite a thin, puny individual going about your life doing X, for example, and then you go with that. You could do the same with measured progression. You could say, well, you're just going to be the same person. Anything you learn through experiences in the game, as long as you can reflect and say, oh, but my character did this 5 weeks ago, so he'll know not to do that again. That's a sort of progression that you role play rather than quantify. And I keep doing that. And then I start thinking, well, what really is left? Is it just the social dynamic at the table?
Yeah, I mean, and there's a joking piece. I talk about this in Elusive Shift that Greg Costigan did that was called Lord of the Dice, right? Which was a game he published in Different World, just a half page worth of game rules. And the game is effectively, okay, the character generation is get some dice, like make up some things that you think are characteristics, roll the dice to get some numbers that you find aesthetically like pleasing for you, and then write those down next to whatever the characteristics are you came up with. And then like, great, the dungeon master will tell you what situation you're in. You just say what you want to do, and the dungeon master will like roll some dice. And if the number seems high, then what happens? What you said you want to do happens. If it's low, it didn't. If it's in the middle, keep rolling until it looks either high or low, and then you'll know from there. And then he's like, you don't need any other rules. Like that's your game. And to him, of course, this was a reductio. He was trying, because he's a game designer, he was trying to show what he perceived as the perils of very freeform approaches to gaming that had begun to be discussed already. And so he's like, well, this is what a freeform system would look like. You see freeform used, for example, in the Traveller book Mercenary in 1979, about a year before Lord of the Dice was written up. But by the early 80s, people really were thinking about freeform systems. What all can you take away? And what actually needs to be left,
Mm.
right? And I think most people, and this is where we get again to when I was talking about hypothetical questions earlier. Um, we have this innate ability to be able to kind of answer hypothetical questions about a situation that we can just make up and say, well, what would you do in this situation? And then there's a different version of that. Well, if you were Clint Eastwood's character in the Western, what would you do in the situation when the guy bursts open the door of the saloon and makes some proclamation? Well, Clint Eastwood might do something different that you would do, right? In this case. But you don't need much in order to sketch that out for people to see the saloon, to see who the Clint Eastwood-like character is, to see who that bad guy is. You already just get that for free in your head for some reason. Even when I give you the barest sketch I just gave you, you imagine something about that because we are just tapping into the same cultural tropes that we're all aware of. But what system really offers is friction, is the possibility that when you say, well, I pull out my six shooter and bam, I pop them through the liver, that it might not work, that something might go wrong because we feel like something could go wrong. And that friction is what the resort to the implements of chance provides, is what like actually rolling the dice, you know, gives you that sense that, yeah, just like in the real world, it is possible for the things I try to do to either succeed or fail. And if we take that away entirely, then the experience becomes like solipsistic and unsatisfying,
Mhm.
right? If we can just say whatever it is and the answer is you do, then like the game is dull. And
Is
so
that a bit
there
like
needs to be
Coventry?
enough system to have that friction to it to make you feel like things you do, at least based on a model that could be very simple or very, very complicated, will work or won't.
So, you describe in more detail than anyone the game Coventry, if you can call it a game. That
Mm.
that was a bit frictionless. I mean, it's not a role-playing game. I mean, I don't think anyone would define it as a role-playing game, but that was quite a frictionless. It was I was going to say frictionless system. There wasn't really a system. So
I mean, the only friction in it was the need for consistency across canon, for continuity.
yeah.
And so, in other words, if you wrote in and said, in my section of Coventry, I want to do this and that would be treading on some previously defined and contradicting some element of the system that's then considered to be canon.
Mm,
Stanbury would push back and say, no, no, you can't do that.
mm.
But otherwise, yeah, I mean, he teased that he was going to make a set of rules for combat for it, kind of towards the end of the phenomenon, circa 62 or maybe in 63. But since those never really came out, we never experienced like that kind of friction. No.
Okay. So
But the
what?
will of other players, I guess is what I want to up level that to. The will of other players can be friction as well, right? As
Yeah.
long as the things they want to do have, some degree of ability to constrain what you want to do. And this, if you look at basic role playing, if I'm not mistaken, even in the 1980 version, there are checks you make kind of against the environment in which there will be some difficulty set by the referee for that. But then there's checks you make against other players and the things they want to do. If what you're doing is contradicting them, then it's your comparative stats in that arena, and then influence the die rolls that then determine who's going to succeed or fail in that. And so that the friction of other people being in it maybe is part of that social element that you were talking about earlier, that you said you find players find so crucial to it. Because if it's just me, and we've all who have desperately gamed at times have had just one referee and one player to play with, right? It's a very different experience than even having two players and one referee.
So the
And yeah,
oh, go
but
ahead. Oh, it's the specific question that we asked respondents. The samples was people who use things like Reddit, EN World, things like this. So these are people who've been playing for multiple decades. The question about socializing. So it was basically a ranking exercise. What are the most important things to you in role playing? Is why do you play? What are the key ingredients for you? And socializing was actually only third, but it was socializing in the sense of spending time with other people rather than fighting against other player characters or doing something that might contradict their will. It was spending time with people and that kind of stuff. But that only came third.
Hmm.
And the alternatives were things like simulation, maximizing your advantage, so power gaming. Those are quite low down, and it might be something to do with the sample. This is an average age of about 39 years, and of course, these are going to be avid gamers rather than the average person. I was actually a bit surprised by that. I thought there'd be quite a few more power gamers in there.
Yeah.
Um, but
Well,
yes,
if you go back and look in Illus and Shift, I have some of the earliest surveys I could find where people tried to locate players on, are you more into role playing and storytelling? You more into conflict simulation or power gaming? And yeah, it's really difficult to get people to admit that they're into power gaming.
yeah.
It was then, and the audience wasn't quite as mature, but from a number of accounts we have of the period power gaming as a phenomenon seemed to flourish between the ages of 12 and 15 or so, right? And
Mm,
and really taper off dramatically after that.
mm.
And so, I mean, I can recall a couple of examples of people in college that were still very into things that we would probably identify with power gaming, but um, the munchkins, that awful term that people used, that they contrasted with the grognards, the munchkins, the little kids who suddenly got into D&D, uh, usually right in the wake of James Dallas Egbert, right when the fad was beginning, when people were making toys and beach towels and paper plates for your birthday that were D&D themed, like kinds of stuff that people just had this that more mature gamers had a very negative attitude towards. I mean, those were the people they saw as being the big power gamers at the time.
I just remember one finding, and I'm moderately baffled by it. This is a bit of a more detailed question than just, what's more important to you. And maybe you can shed some insight on this as well. So I asked these people, 300 odd people, if someone's player character does something nice for your player character, would you feel grateful to the real player of that PC? And the vast majority said yes. And then I flipped the question. If a player character promises you something but then betrays you, would you feel angry towards the player? And the vast majority said no. So what this at surface level indicates to me is that people are surprised when another player is nice to them, but they're not at all surprised when they're not. And this flies in the face of my own intuition. I thought, how does that fit in with having a good time with the people around you? I don't know if you have any thoughts on it. I've just kind of landed that on you straight off, but I'm still working on trying to interpret that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly you see very early on, even in Coventry, if you go back into this, and this was actually not in my first edition of Playing at the World. This is stuff that I actually found later and integrated into the second edition. You know, we find even then with as limited as that game, if we want to call it a game, was, people who just got really invested in their player characters and identified with them to the extent that other people commented that that identification had grown too strong and it was a problem for the game, that people felt like anything that happened to their character they had to take personally. And so I mean, that we have that going back to like 1960 is pretty striking. I mean, I think we think of that as something that emerged in the wake of D&D, and indeed, I've seen people see it as being more like vampire or something. No, no, this has been around like forever. This notion that it's kind of a sin to take badly like something that happened to your character, to take it personally. I guess it does make sense to. It's not counterintuitive to me because that's the thing that people really frown upon. Things, good things happening to you. Um, you know, I mean, I guess from your socialization perspective of the people who are there to have a good time and be chums with everyone, I guess I can see how the bleed in that, and I guess bleed is a bit of a technical term, the bleed in that seems just more socially acceptable, right? Whereas the bleed in the other seems like it is you're actually committing like an RPG sin if you take these things too personally.
Hmm. That would make so that I had a chat with a guy. I don't know if you know Mark Barrowcliff. He wrote The Elfish Gene, which was a
Mhm.
British book about his experience. He had a very weird relationship with D&D when he was in his teens, in that he didn't like the people that he played with, but he was addicted to the game and therefore just kept playing. So he was the definition of someone who didn't want the people, just wanted to play the game and would have had different people if he possibly could have, but he had no options at the time. And he said, when the DM attacked him, his character, it felt like he was being attacked personally. In fact, not just it felt like that, he interpreted it
Mhm.
as an attack on him personally. So it just strikes me that when you say that thing, that was going on, this would have been the mid 70s as well, because that's when he was playing. But even though he feels that, and I'm not saying he's done my survey, so I'm not sure if his answer's anywhere in there. It probably hasn't. Um, the idea then would be that, but he wouldn't be angry about that because that's how the game is supposed to go. You're supposed to, people get knocked off, they get hit, they get punched and stuff like that. The surprise is when someone is nice to you. I find that a little bit depressing, if I'm entirely honest, because it does suggest that, oh my God, you were nice to me. Oh God, I love you so much. That's really great, which suggests that it's a surprise. It's infrequent.
Well, and
You're a
I
party.
think yeah, maybe related to this. I mean, when you look at power gaming and the bias against power gaming, even the prejudice against power gaming, the flip side of that is it's viewed as kind of mature to like games where things don't go well for you.
Hmm.
So the implication of power gaming is, and that this is horrible, and this kind of goes back to the wish fulfillment that you see in a lot of the way people characterize comics appreciation or even fantasy fiction appreciation, right? Where, oh, well, you only like these stories about a Superman because you're a weakling and you want to identify with this like Superman. And I think there's a view that that's immature, right? And that is carried over into RPGs where the mature thing is, we're normal, well-adjusted people. You and I, we have reasonably good lives. The wolf is not at our doors at the moment, right? Like, I mean, we've both been somewhat, at least somewhat successful in our lives. And, we don't need this wish fulfillment dimension, right, to make our lives better. So we get pleasure from games maybe where things don't go as well for us, or we're more open to games where not only are we not going to be the powerful people, we're going to be the people that are going to experience horrible things, Call of Cthulhu level, like horrible things, right? And whether that perception that one is more mature or whatever than the other is accurate, I think is immaterial. I think a bit of that just came along with science fiction fandom and fantasy fandom into D&D's DNA and into the DNA of its players.
Okay. I only have one more question. It's actually just popped into my head while we've been talking, so I quickly wrote it down. And it's about the kind of people that you and I will probably spend the least time with, which is never gamers. So one of the things I want to look into is why people play. I mean, really, that's the main question. And presumably they play because they get something out of it. And maybe if they play a lot of it, they change somehow. And I'd like to know how people change as a result of playing or DMing or whatever it might be, um, at a psychological level, personality, and so on and so forth. There are people who can't stand even the thought of entertaining a counterfactual along the lines that you described me earlier, even with something relatively realistic, like someone coming to a cafe with a gun. And as once you take that into elves and fairylands and stuff, there's a visceral reaction there. I don't know if you have any thoughts on what makes this is such a hard question, I know, what makes someone want to play these games at all, and what makes those people who just no, I want nothing. I mean, because maybe you come across it when you introduce something about what you do, and maybe you get a reaction from some people like, "Oh, why would you want to do anything like that? I mean, that's kind of weird, nerdy stuff." Do you have any inkling as to what differentiates all these gamers and people that you have spoken to, and presumably the others that you've spoken less to, but who are never gamers?
I mean, I think this is much more your problem than mine, to be blunt. I'm an archivist man who goes through and finds like early things. And, what I get when I think about this is all the things I've read about. I'm thinking about Robert Louis Stevenson on the floor in Davos playing war games in 1880 with his new stepson, feeling embarrassed when adults come in and see them there playing. And H.G. Wells has a very similar, although far more sexist version of this in Little Wars, where he talks about, him having set up whatever this parlor is for the Little Wars game, and that a great, I mean, it's pretty bad. It's like a great chattering of women like come in ignore this with all the empty disdain of their sex for all things imaginative, I think is the quote. Had flying a lot of hazard tape there, but I mean, I think throughout history there has been this notion that yeah, gaming is something that only appeals to a certain set of person, and it's not complimentary that it does. This is related, I think, to what we were just discussing a moment ago about kind of what the appeal of power gaming is versus maybe a more putatively mature approach to the game, where it's easier for you to accept negative things happening to your character because your character's power isn't what you're invested in the game. You're invested in something else. I mean, to me, I think there's something else that we're invested in is that creation of the story. And whether you're a referee or a player, I mean, maybe one of the things that they share in common, at least in successful games, is a similar commitment to the development of whatever this narrative or experience, I should say, is going to be. It's an experience while we're having it in a narrative in retrospect, at least in my thinking it is. And that experience is what I mean I'm in it for, and I think most of the players I deal with are in it for. It's for that. People say use words like immersion. Immersion has also been a term that's very problematized, but that momentary feeling that what you're experiencing, even though you're just describing it with words and in the most cursory way, uh, supplants or overlays reality, not in any escapist sense. And I'm one of those people that I hate that people consider these games be escapist because let's be blunt, if you're watching here at home, there is no escape. Like this is it, man. All of our experiences are real. There's no escape. The question is just what kind of experiences are you going to populate our existence on this planet, the brief time we have with, right? And the experience you have of being a wizard in a role-playing game is nothing like the experience of what being the experience of a wizard would be if you were actually in one of these worlds, which would be a terrible experience like none of us would want to have, right? So this experience we have when we play these games and is what we're after, is what we get out of it. And definitely not everybody wants that. Not everyone is attracted to that. I mean, I'm not attracted to sports. I know a ton of people that go to like sports stadiums and they watch like football or baseball or whatever. I don't understand at all. And so, in some sense, I'm perfectly happy to say different folks like different stuff, which is indeed something we'll see a lot of people say at the beginning of the elusive shift when we're talking about the early expressions of difference, even among the play styles of gamers looking at D&D then. But, the people who love the development of that communal experience of an imaginary world to the point where you leave enough of the mundane world behind that you are having an experience, not an experience of that world, but this whatever the approximation RPG experience is, you have that's what people are after and what they get from it. Why some people like that and some people don't, I mean, that has to be more your question than mine, man.
No, yeah, completely agree. I just wanted you to answer it for me for free. This is
Yeah. Well, I don't think that's a satisfying answer to anyone, right? Uh, I
um,
think I think we need some quantification to wrap around all this, which you can provide through your clinical tests.
that's the I mean, clinical is a bit, yeah. John, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you again. I really, really appreciate it. Is there anything you wanted to say for anyone who was watching this in terms of what you're doing now or anything like that?
Well, no, I'm not really a plugger. Yeah, you can see on the wall behind Stephen here, there's a number of books there that I think I I wrote some of those. I think I wrote all of those actually, but
You got a chapter in the 50 years, two
that's
chapters,
right.
one
Yes,
chapter, two chapters.
just one.
Okay. Yeah.
It's one where I try to explain what made the Blackmore campaign so innovative. Yeah.
And my comment on these books would be once I read these, I realized I did not need to write a history of Dungeons and Dragons or the prehistory of Dungeons and Dragons because it has been done, and in my view, it will never be done better.
Oh, wow.
I'm very glad that my questions differ.
Well, yeah. So there's yeah, I will say if all you're doing is archivism, archival work and saying like here are the sources that are interesting and here's why you should think they're interesting, which is all I do, it's pretty easy to leave a lot of room for other people to answer the important questions.
It's all important, and loads of my hypotheses come out of the histories. I mean, I would never have learned about the Bristol Wargaming Group, the Coventry. Coventry is the thing that fascinates me the most because, well, I mean, we could go into that another time, but the idea of playing a game without a game, but being so immersed that you dress up, you go to conventions, it went on for years. And the amount of detail in it for something lacking a system is incredible. So there was something innate going, already in human. I mean, this was in California. They had the time, presumably, to think about these kinds of things. They
I
weren't in
also
Afghanistan or something, but
Right, right. But yeah, I think you also, and not to start us into a whole other 20-minute discussion, like you also have to look at it because it was, specific to science fiction fandom. These were people who were familiar with a shared universe where a number of writers invoke the same elements. The Weird Tales crowd, overlaps between what Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, all those people were writing and filling in kind of different parts of the same world. I mean, I don't think that idea was so totally foreign to them. Now, taking it to the level that you dress up and you're enacting these things, well, I mean, again, you can find pictures of Robert E. Howard wearing a loincloth,
mm,
right? Like
mm.
fighting, holding, somebody holding a spear that's a friend of his, right? I mean, they really took this to a level seeking that immersion, I think, right? Like seeking that um feeling you got, especially after Tolkien in the late 1960s, when you see people starting to talk about Middle Earth. And I cite some examples of this in Playing at the World, putting personal ads in magazines looking for people to accompany you back to Middle Earth, like, because you're a homesick poet adventurer and like you've got to get to the Misty Mountains. Like just there was a need for something that was not passive, that was not just that was a literary experience where you're a mere spectator to it. And I think people played with a lot of different pieces in the mid 20th century that ultimately became the building blocks that then Dungeons and Dragons took and said, "Oh, I can do that." Like I'll give you this, very versatile, flexible thing. They'll let you be able to take any fantasy world that you like, and I'll give you that friction that I was talking about that is like so essential to this, but you'll then be able to have that feeling of protagonism and experience of the world. And that is how D&D changed the world, was by bringing that, just combining those elements and presenting them in a way that it became a toolkit for just tremendous creativity and innovation.
Couldn't ask for a better ending, really, could I?